Hello, good morning, Europe. Good afternoon, China. Hello, wherever you are.
Perfect. Thank you.
I was thinking of giving this presentation online, but not recording myself, so I feel a bit weird that I cannot interact with you. I hope we can have an opportunity to interact during the conference.
Apps. Ugh. I'm sorry, Eva.
Hello, good morning, Europe. Good afternoon, China. Hello, wherever you are. I was thinking of giving this presentation online, but not recording myself, so I feel a bit weird that I cannot interact with you. I hope we can have an opportunity to interact during the conference. My name is Eva Mendez. I'm a faculty member, a researcher in the Library and Information Science Department at the Universidad Carlos III de Madrid in Spain, and I'm also the chair of the European Open Science Policy Platform. I'm giving you this background so you can understand what is my perspective of FAIR principles from the European perspective. Because in my presentation, I will focus, in one hand, in the context of European open science, and also in the other hand, in the technical perspective of FAIR data from my own understanding of the metadata, which is my field of expertise. And also we'll try to give a correlation between the importance of FAIR data and the European Open Science Cloud that you probably know that is the main infrastructure for data, for research data in Europe that we are creating currently. So probably with these two tips you will understand much better my presentation, thinking of also my background as a researcher on metadata and as a chair of the European Open Science Policy Platform. So let's start thinking about what is open science at the European level. The open science is a systematic change in the way we do science, in the modus operandi we do research. The other thing is that we have to think about that the open science is not something that affects only to data, only to publications. It affects to the whole research cycle and all the stakeholders. What you have in this slide here is the 8 pillars, the 8 challenges that we have been addressing in the European Open Science Policy Platform in the last 4 years. Then, of course, the bottleneck is the rewards and incentive, but I will not focus today on this. I will focus in the elements that they are related with the data, with the research data. One is FAIR data, and the other one is the construction of the European Open Science Cloud, that they are completely related on this construction of the open science at the European. This is the final report that we had presented in April 2020 to the European Commission that is entitled Progress on Open Science Towards Shared Research Knowledge System. And in this report, we try to gather all the practical commitments for implementation of open science at a stakeholder level, because the European Open Science Policy Platform is a stakeholder platform, a stakeholder group of people. And at this level, we have a kind of declaration of principles and also declaration of recommendations in the previous report. But here we are focusing in the practical implementation. And in this context, we try to focus on FAIR data, on FAIR research data management as a key element of an interoperable and secure infrastructure that, like EOSC or any other, have to be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Because the data that we are addressing in the open science, they have to be fair, even though that could be open or not. And the Commission and the European Commission at the European level, we think about having as open as possible, as close as necessary. But FAIR is broadly understood as a standard for data management, of a standard basis. FAIR is not a standard as such, it's a collection of principles that you have heard probably in the conference many times already. But it's not a standard, but it's a standard way to address data management at European level and at infrastructure level. But it doesn't mean automatically that FAIR should be open. But we want also to have as much open as we can research data. Also, in the European perspective of data, I always say that FAIR is the best acronym ever, because we say findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable, and that's it, full stop. But this is like a friend of mine in Australia, she used to say that FAIR principles are like the IKEA instructions, okay? It's very easy when you see them, but when you start applying the instructions, you think that is more complicated, and the furniture not always ends up to be what you want to be. So this is why in the context of the European projects, all the data should be fair. That seems to be very easy. We have guidelines for data management in the projects of Horizon 2020, which is the current research program. But at the end, it's not so easy to apply because it has a component of data and metadata that is really technical issues that you have to address very carefully, and taking into account the diversity of data that an infrastructure, a European level or whatever level, has. As you know, as I told you before, this means findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, which is the mantra of the research data in Europe. And we put also open in a context that where open data is about more than disclose. It must be fair. This is fair by default, and then we will see if we can, on top of the fairness, open them, because the openness is a question of licensing and the fairness is a question of technical approaches to make them more fair. Also, when we think about research data, the idea is open by default, but that doesn't mean that always can be open. So in this case, I will say that Horizon 2020 projects are required to deposit the underlying research data, what we call the raw data and their metadata, and other data that they can use in the project in a repository, in a trustworthy repository, or in an infrastructure. And also we have to take as much measures as we can to grant open access if it is possible, if it is not data protected by the GDPR, if they are not data protected by privacy issues or by commercial issues or some other problems that they can happen with the data. And also we are encouraged to share the data, not only the ones that they are related with a publication, but also all the data that we are using through the research cycle in a European project. But let me add you some more R's. I always say that it's not only a question of fair, it's a question of fair. It's not that I sleep on the R, is that I think we need also to think about reliable data and reproducible data, that they are two other important questions that they can address on fair data, for example, in the context of health information, clinical information, that this is also crucial to apply these or two more R's. If we come at the European level, not only in the FAIR principles, in the FAIR approaches, in the FAIR acronym, we can also go farther, have a bigger frame, and think about the European law. The new European directive, which is the public sector, Open Data and Public Sector Information Directive, which is the Directive 1024, that was published last year in June 2019. In the Article 10 talks about research data. Beforehand in Europe, in the public sector information, it is said the governmental information, all the data regarding the performance of the public sector, the performance of the government data, the administrative data, They didn't include research data as part of the public sector information. But from this new directive, we also include as open data for the public sector the research data. So all the member states, we should support the availability of those research data when they come up from publicly funded research. And we have to apply this principle of open by default that I mentioned before, and also the FAIR principles. So not only in a way of research projects as a requirement of a research grant, but also as a requirement of the directive of reusability of the public sector information and open data, we are required in the research data world to make and apply data fair. And also as open as possible, as close as necessary, which is something like yes, but not if you can, you see. But the point is that all these principles apply for the research performing organizations, but also for the research funding organizations. That's why we have now, in a framework of legal situations, we have also this important context of the fair data. If we go to the meaning of findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, you probably have seen these data principles in detail in other presentations. But if you look at that, you see all the time metadata, metadata, data, and metadata. And the metadata are implied in the 4 features of FAIR, in the findability, in the accessibility, in the interoperability, and also in the reusability, where we would have to think about not only on the data, but also on the metadata relevant to the domain. If we are thinking on the health information, we have to think about the metadata that we use in our field. And also, if we think about the guiding principles of fair data, in my opinion, is 80% of metadata and 20% of persistent identifiers. This was a joke that I had over a Twitter conversation in a conference with Barem Mons, that he is now the current president of CoData. But we were thinking that at the end, what we have to have is that 80% of those digital objects, that means not only the metadata, but the content and the operations, they should be applicable in the FAIR data. And also we have to apply persistent identifiers to all these digital objects. But in the context of metadata, they are at the core of the FAIR data. We have here a set of principles from kind of explanation of those principles of FAIR data from a perspective of metadata, made by EUDAT, which is another platform at the European level of research data. And also you can fix there that metadata are at the core of the applicability at the technical approach of FAIR data. And when we come to European Open Science Cloud, I always use this metaphor to talk about the European Open Science Cloud, which is a story of children. For children, it's a book story for children that is called Where the Wild Things Are. And I think the European Open Science Cloud nowadays is still like that. It's a lot of expectation, a lot of FAIR data, but we don't know yet if it is already organized or it is already managed in a proper way. With the Commissioner Moedas, the previous Commissioner of Research and Innovation, defined the European Open Science Cloud, he said that it's a supporting environment for open science, but not an open cloud for science. Sometimes we have this joke that the European Open Science Cloud is not European, it's not open, it's no science, and it's no cloud. But at the end, it is infrastructure. It's a name that we gave to an infrastructure for a federated European endeavor to make all the research data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, with a bunch of data, with a bunch of data services, not only the data, but the services around. In this context, if we come to fair data, we have to think about that the European Open Science Cloud addresses main scientific communities, that they are intensive data producers like physics or like earth science, but also we have to think about the long tail of science. Where are those minimum repositories that they collect some data, also data for citizen science practices, but all these data, they have to be in the same platform in a data layer. And also we are describing in the European Open Science Cloud a service layer about, for example, analytics, or about high performance computing, or even about intellectual property rights protection. But also we are creating a governance layer, which is this week was celebrated in Europe, workshop, a summit on European Open Science Cloud. And one of the most important topics was the discussion of the governance, the legal sustainability, the association that is created, etc. But if we think about fair data, we have to think also not only about the infrastructures, the data layer, the service layer, and the governance layer. We have also to think about the metadata layer, that for me is what converts fair data in not only fair, but de-fair. And for me, de-fair means findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, but also discoverable. When the discoverability means the chance to discover, the chance to do research by serendipity, when you can find information among different domains about cross-disciplinary research, and you can find data that they can enrich by chance or by serendipity the discoveries that you are doing. Because the fairness is more attached to the findability, but findability is attached to the knowledge that some data exist. The discoverability more attached on the metadata layer that we are creating nowadays. They are more based on the discovery as such, the possibility or the art of finding some data that you really want to use, but you didn't know they exist. So this is my 2 cents to this conference. I think it has been a bit probably longer than expected, or it was very long for me because I didn't see your faces and nodding or something like that. I hope we can interact through my email, my Twitter account, or even including in the project that I'm involved now as a Fair is Fair for Health, and also as a Research Data Alliance ambassador for interoperable research. Thank you very much for your attention.